Good evening, everyone. I'm the mysterious Lee, who edits the UFO Encounter magazine. And I'm just going to be talking about Project Blue Book in light of the current or the mandated supposed release of documents or files on UFOs from the United States intelligence community, which was one of Donald Trump's last mandates before he left office and was impeached and acquitted and all of that. I just want to make clear at the start that I'm not a Project Blue Book expert. I don't know everything about Project Blue Book. There is plenty on the internet, though, for people who want to investigate. There are movies, there are documentaries, there's books, articles, lots of stuff with a lot of in-depth information from the past, and it's well worth looking into because it's such a fascinating topic. So in December of 2020, as mentioned, Donald Trump's government put out a mandate that gave all US intelligence agencies 180 days to disclose information. This is only one of the articles that was around, which I find a bit annoying because it puts a humorous slant on it, as usual, about Scully and Mulder. If only Scully and Mulder had waited for a pandemic. Buried in the latest federal omnibus spending bill signed into law on December 27, 2020, is a mandate that may bring UFO watchers one step closer to finding out whether the government has been watching the skies. So this bill gave all the US intelligence agencies, even though the ones quoted in this article are the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence, gave them all 180 days, which is 6 months, to prepare a report for senators and armed services committees on the potential existence of UFOs and any potential they may have to pose a threat. Now, during Trump's term of office, he many times made mention of UFOs and hinted that he knew stuff and that he would possibly disclose information. He didn't do that during his term, but he certainly left us a parting gift, which is this. And hopefully in 6 months, which will be June sometime, we'll see some results. But don't get excited because the US Senate will see some results. If any results are forthcoming, I still think that most US agencies will keep a lid on the stuff they consider most interesting or most dangerous or what they want to keep secret. And how long it will take for the general public to see a result after that is anybody's guess. But the wheels are in motion. Now, all of this, of course, is easier said than done. And a few years ago, I spent a lot of time in the CIA's reading room, which was a hell of a lot of fun because you could type in anything and this reading room would bring you piles and mountains of information. And I loved it. You could spend hours in there. But there's a new management at the CIA and they've taken away that reading room and given us this resources page, which is useless. So you come along and it brings you to these pages where they've got curated information, things they want you to see, not things you want to see, things they want you to see. And as I said, it's curated. So this is the new CIA logo, as you can see here. So we've had quite a big change at the CIA. And if you go into your reading room, you type in UFO, as I've done here, all you get are 4 items. It is ludicrous. Whereas before you would get hundreds, thousands. Now you get 4. The top 2 are curated. The top 2 are curated folders, which you can tell here because it says stories. So you go in there and they'll give you a handful of documents they want you to see. The other 2 are actually quite interesting. I'm surprised they've left them there because they're quite damning documents if you wanted to go in and have a look. But you know, UFOs aren't always called UFOs. We're talking about the 1940s and 50s. So you stick in flying saucer and you get 77 documents. Again, there used to be hundreds and all of them, or most of them are unrelated. You get the top 3 X-Files. This one has flying saucer. You get an Area 51 and then you get the Flying Dutchman and other unrelated nonsense. Again, they want to direct you to the X-Files, this take a peek into our X-Files, which is, just to give you an example of what you're seeing, this is what the CIA gives you in their X-Files. Again, we're talking about Scully and Mulder, which is also annoying. That's just me talking though. And you get some interesting documents. This one, the UFOs over the Belgian Congo, is very interesting, but they're just one pages. There's nothing really exciting in there. And it seems as though the CIA's reading room has become more and more obtuse. Now, a few years ago, I was able to type in Project Blue Book into the CIA's reading room and actually get a copy of Project Blue Book. I couldn't find it anymore. You type in Project Blue Book, you get, again, how to investigate a flying saucer. You get this, a blue yin-yang symbol in the center, strangers on a bridge. It's a friggin' book review. Excuse me, I'm allowed to swear, but I did swear. Sorry, Cheryl. All unrelated, but other people besides me downloaded a copy of Project Blue Book, which is special report number 14, and you can find it in other places on the internet if you go in and type them. You don't need to waste time in the CIA's reading room. Now, this is where I come out and confess once more, just to let it be known, I'm no expert on Blue Book. You're not going to get too much information, but you'll get a little bit. This presentation is sort of more about how Blue Book has affected UFO research ever since it came out in the 1950s. So the first official UFO investigation project was called Project Saucer. In 1947, towards the end of 1947, the start of 1948, Project Saucer became Project Sign, which came about because Kenneth Arnold had had his UFO sighting by now, and people were reporting hundreds of UFOs. So somebody had to investigate them. In 1948, Project Sign's mandate was to determine whether some UFOs were spaceships or whether some were satellites. I'd like to wonder what satellites they were thinking about in 1948, because I don't think that humans had anything up there, but I guess there are natural satellites floating around in our atmosphere, or above our atmosphere, I should say. Project Sign wasn't bad because they had the idea that some UFOs were real, although they weren't aircraft that we were familiar with or of unfamiliar configuration. And in 1948, they compiled a report entitled Estimate of the Situation, which included the following statements. Based on the evidence, UFOs were alien spacecraft. If there is an extraterrestrial civilization which can make such objects, then it is most probable that its development is far in advance of ours. This argument can be supported on probability alone without recourse to astronomical hypothesis. So they're saying we don't need astronomers to sit there and say, you know, out of 10 billion stars, there are 100 million planets that could be habitable and 1 million of those could have life, etc., etc. Based on probability alone, there could be life outside of Earth. But despite that promising start, in 1948, General Hoyt Vandenberg landed in the project. He was a problem. He didn't believe in UFOs, or at least stated he didn't believe in UFOs, and he established a policy that the interplanetary hypothesis, which was what they were working on, should be rejected. He maintained that UFOs were a military problem, which is what resulted or started the withholding of information from scientists and the public, and pretty much actively kicked off dissemination of disinformation. Despite all of this, UFOs were being seen. We've got news reports of jets being told to shoot down flying saucers. Stuff was happening, but Hoyt Vandenberg at the project that was established to investigate the situation said there wasn't a problem. But as mentioned, UFOs kept being seen. They were reported in the news. They were being talked about. You couldn't deny that they were there. 1949 saw the end of Project Sign and the beginning of Project Grudge. So this is a blue book, but it acknowledges Project Grudge on the cover page. Project Grudge disagreed with the findings of Project Sign and maintained that the US Air Force had solved all UFO sightings. So this is in 1949. They're solved. Just want you to know that. But UFOs kept being seen and the problem really hadn't been solved, which led to the establishment of Project Blue Book, which became the public face of official, as in Air Force or government, UFO research. So Project Blue Book commenced in 1952 and continued it until January 1970. That was when its last report came out. Officially, it's the longest governmental UFO research project in the United States, as far as we know, and its status remained top secret for decades. The project had two goals, which was to determine if UFOs were a threat to national security or could contribute to security or scientific research, and to analyze the UFO data so far collected by the US Air Force. This is in 1952. So during the time in 1952 when Special Report number 14 was being prepared, the chairperson of Project Blue Book was Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, whose name will be familiar to most of you. Ruppelt was open-minded about the subject, and just as an aside, after he resigned from the Air Force, he wrote a book about Blue Book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. J. Allen Hynek, who you will also know, was Blue Book's technical advisor. He had also been an advisor on grudge and sign, and he was very skeptical of UFOs at first until he had to admit that they were inexplicable and became, understandably, a believer. Hynek was the man responsible for the close encounter categorization system, which is close encounter 1, 2, 3, and 4, depending on how close you get to a UFO or an occupant of a UFO. So these were the best years of Blue Book's life, apparently, because the personnel pursued the topic with open minds. Which is just as well, because UFOs kept on being seen. So, despite this open-mindedness, Blue Book was hampered from day one, because apart from Vandenberg's earlier rejection of the interplanetary hypothesis, people also claimed that not all UFO reports or data were made available to Blue Book, and it's almost certain that they had no physical evidence at all to work with. There is no mention that I could find anywhere of the crash disk from Roswell or any other crash disk, so it's almost as though they were working in a vacuum, if Roswell is true, which we think it is. So J. Allen Hynek was aware of the problem. He was of the opinion that Blue Book's results weren't great because they didn't have all the data. And he would have known that stuff was missing because he would have certainly heard about things that had been happening. So this is the cover of the Special Report number 14. It was completed in 1953, but wasn't made available to the public, or it was not made available to the public for decades, I should say. But it wasn't published until 1955. So it sat there for 2 years. And in that 2 years, a lot of discussion went on about it before it actually came out to government agencies. So what was in this? Here, this is the table of contents, which I don't know how big this is on your screen, but there are 312 pages in total, which includes an introduction, a discussion, evaluation. There are illustrations and over 150 pages of charts and graphs, which starts about here. You see page 95 is probably the last most interesting thing. After that, you have about 150 pages of numbers, which totally is mind-boggling. But at least the people that prepared this report were showing their data and their workings out as well, which is really interesting. So the 2-page introduction outlines the history of the problem as it was in 1953. They say the unfortunate term flying saucer or flying disc requires definition. Many definitions have been offered, one of the best being that originated by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who at the time was the director of an observatory at the Ohio State University. But reading his definition, it's just, I don't know, I'll read it out loud, see if you can make sense of it. So Hynek's definition of the term is any aerial phenomenon or sighting that remains unexplained to the viewer at least long enough for him to write a report about it. So how long does it take to write a report? A minute, a week, a year? It's a very bizarre statement. Then he goes on to say each flying saucer has associated with it a probable lifetime. It wanders in the field of public inspection like an electron in a field of ions until captured by an explanation which puts an end to its existence as a flying saucer. Like, what the? Very strange. Blue Book then goes on to say the term flying saucers shall be used hereafter in this report to mean a novel airborne phenomenon, a manifestation that is not a part of or readily explainable by the fund of scientific knowledge known to be possessed by the free world as compared to the unfree world. We're talking of a time period which saw the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War. So this would include such items as natural phenomena that are not yet completely understood, psychological phenomena, or intruder aircraft of a type that may be possessed by some source in large enough numbers so that more than one independent mission may have been flown and reported. Thus, these phenomena are of the type which should have been observed and reported more than once. So this is the kind of language that you're getting in this introduction. So early in 1952, the Air Force's cumulative study and analysis indicated that the majority of reports could be accounted for as misinterpretations of known objects, such as meteors, balloons, or aircraft, a few as the result of mild hysteria, only very mild, and a few as the result of unfamiliar meteorological phenomena and light aberrations. However, a significant number of fairly complete reports by reliable observers remain unexplained. So this is sort of where the beginning of the disinformation process, where everything is explainable as a natural or phenomena or a balloon. We haven't seen the swamp gas explanation yet. So the document outlined the challenges and limitations of the research and described the methodology used on the project, making special note of the use of IBM punch cards for computer analysis. And if anyone out there was alive in the 50s and 60s, you'll remember the IBM punch card, which is a very strange thing. There were a lot of cards punched. So here's an example of some of the data in there. So all sightings, they had 3,201 cards, which would be fed into an IBM computer and collated. Unit sightings, 2,500. Unit sighting single observers, 2,232. Multiple observers, I'll just say, just thousands and thousands of cards. So preliminary tabulations of various sortings substantiated the impossibility of deriving statistical results from certain variables such as movement of the observer during the sighting, sound, shape parameter, size, angular velocity and acceleration, appearance and disappearance, bearing, initial and final elevation, altitude and orientation of the object. So they have put a lot of thought into it. There's a lot of variables and they've taken note of them all, but have they got anywhere with the evaluation? Here's an example of an IBM punch card, which is in one of the appendices. All of these, they punch little holes which are fed through a computer. The computer reads the holes. It's an old-fashioned thing. It's really old-fashioned, the good old days. Okay, they go through the origin and nature of the data. Included were reports from reputable scientists, mind you, not disreputable scientists, housewives, farmers, students, and technically trained members of the armed forces. Reports varied in length from a few sentences stating that a flying saucer had been sighted to those containing thousands of words, including description, speculation, and advice on how to handle the problem. Some reports were of high quality, conservative, and as complete as the observer could make them. A few originated from people confined to mental institutions. A critical examiner of the reports revealed, however, that a high percentage of them were submitted by serious people, mystified by what they had seen and motivated by patriotic responsibility, which is all very interesting. The second step in evaluation of reports, the rating of the observer, logically followed the first step. Ratings were assigned on the basis of the following factors of information considered in relation to one another, which was the experience of the observer deduced from his occupation, age, and training, the consistency among the separate portions of the description, the general quality and completeness of the report, and consideration of the observer's fact reporting ability. I don't know how they made that consideration, but apparently they could qualitatively define it. The third step in the press evaluation, and this is a very interesting step, take heed, the attempted identification of the object or object cited was done twice. first by the individual who made the transcription of the data. So the person typing down the report decided what it was that had been seen. And if they couldn't figure it out, the final identification was by a conference of 4 persons, 2 representatives from the ATIC, which is the Air Technical Intelligence Command or something, and 2 from the panel of consultants. So 4 people made those decisions on whether a UFO report was an actual UFO report. So accordingly, categories for objects most frequently present in the air were provided. Balloons, aircraft, astronomical bodies such as meteors, birds and clouds or dust were recognised as major categories. The less frequent but common objects such as kites, fireworks, flares, rockets, contrails and meteorological phenomena like small tornadoes were collected into a category called other. A separate category for the uncommon natural phenomena associated with light reflections or refractions such as mirages, sundogs, inversion layers and distortions caused by airborne ice was established with the title of light phenomenon. Other categories were insufficient information, psychological manifestations and unknown were provided. So it's concerning of the psychological creep that's coming in. Here's an example of, or it's just a list of the previous categories, which is balloons, going all the way down to psychological manifestations. So in the initial analysis, the category of unknowns came down to 9%, which you can see here. But that was too many. They didn't think there should be anywhere near as many. So they re-evaluated the data and got it down to 3%. But just to go back to the previous slide, the USAF decided that better reporting skills were required, resulting in the development of a number of new tools and the delegation of UFO investigations to just 1 squadron. So because of that, they were able to get that unknown down from 9% to 3%, and they therefore declared it improbable that UFOs represent observations of technological developments outside the range of present-day scientific knowledge. Just here's a little picture of the psychological manifestations because it amused me. The identification category, this identification category was assigned to report when, although it was well established that the observer had seen something, it was also obvious that the description of the sighting had been overdrawn. Religious fanaticism, a desire for publicity, or an overactive imagination were the most common mental aberrations. I didn't know that an imagination was a mental aberration. And a desire for publicity is also a mental aberration. Here's a marvelous example of some of the charts, which are completely beyond my interpretation. I just put it here for you to see. Does any of this make any sense to anyone? So we've got poor, excellent, doubtful, good. We've got beautiful little, I don't know. Anyway, good example. Here's some more charts, which is a comparison of known and unknown object sightings by color, which I think is very interesting because they're all the same sorts of colors that we see today, which is white, metallic, not stated, orange, red, and other. Then we have an estimation of speed, which stationary less than 100 miles an hour, 100 to 400 miles an hour, more than 400, meteor-like, not stated. This is a monthly distribution. This is for the United States. So there's an increase in July and August, the summer months, which is probably like here when people are sitting outside smoking. Again, we've got, it's just reams and reams of numerical figures and data, like 150 pages of this sort of stuff. Here we've got shapes, we've got elliptical. Again, remember, this is 1949, 1950 through to 1952, and we're seeing the sorts of shapes that I don't know about anyone else, but I didn't think were being seen at that time. I always had this idea in my head that the 1950s were the traditional UFO type shapes, but it turns out that all the shapes we see today were being seen back then. So we've got elliptical, rocket or aircraft, meteor or comet, which I guess would be a white light with a bit of a trail, teardrop, lenticular, conical, flame, other not stated, which is very interesting. Now, the flying saucer model is not about that they were trying to make a plastic three-dimensional model of it. It was a theoretical model, which they hoped to make as an outcome of all the data that they had collected. But it turned out to be impossible to do this, as you would imagine, given the different shapes and states. So out of the thousands of reports that were positively identified by the Blue Book team of 4 as being weather balloons, aircraft, meteorological phenomenon or other, only 12 of those, all those reports were deemed strange enough to be called UFOs. That's out of 434 sightings. And I'm going to go through, these are included in this special report number 14, because going back to what I was saying earlier about the types of UFOs that were seen, as I said, these are all the sorts of strange UFOs that we hear about today, and they were all around then in the 1940s and 50s, which is absolutely fascinating. So this is case 1, this weird, I want to say boomerang, but it's not even remotely boomerang, lightning bolt shaped craft, I guess, from 2 men were driving across a bridge at 10 o'clock in the morning in 1948 when they saw an object glide, I can't see that because it says talking, across the road a few hundred feet in front of them. It was shiny and metallic in construction, about 6 to 8 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was in a flat glide path at an altitude of about 30 feet, was seen for only a few seconds and went down in a wooded area. This one is kind of aircraft shaped, but not really. It had a fuzzy area, 2 pointed ends and a light glow, which was by a naval aviation student, his wife, and several others were at a drive-in movie in 1952, during which time they saw several groups of objects fly over. There were from 2 to 9 objects in the group, and there were about 20 groups, so that's a significant amount of strange-looking aircraft. The groups of objects flew in a straight line, except for some changes in direction, accomplished in a manner like any standard aircraft turn. The objects were shaped like conventional aircraft. The unaccountable feature of the objects was that each had a red glow surrounding it and was glowing itself, though it was a cloudless night. Okay, this is case number 3, which is a strange, like a cross-shaped or 2 cigar-shaped objects stuck together. 2 tower operators sighted a light over a city airport at 2020 hours on January 29, 1951. Since a commercial plane was taking off at this time, the pilots were asked to investigate. They observed it at 2026 hours. According to them, it flew abreast of them at a greater radius as they made their climbing turn, during which time it blinked some lights which looked like running lights. While the observing plane was still in its climbing turn, the object made a turn towards the plane and flew across its nose. As the 2 men turned their heads to watch it, it instantly appeared on their other side, flying in the same direction as they were, and then in 2 or 3 seconds it slipped under them and they didn't see it again. So that's also a very curious one. You'll notice that these are all being reported mostly by professional pilot people, except for this one. The part-time farmer and his hired hand were curing tobacco at midnight in 1952 when they looked up and saw 2 cigar-shaped objects. One hovered while the other moved to the east and came back, at which both time ascended till out of sight. It was stated that they appeared to be transparent and illuminated from the inside. This is case 5. A pilot and co-pilot were flying a DC-3 in 1948 when they saw an object coming towards them. It passed them to the right and slightly above them, at which time it went to a steep climb and was lost from sight in some clouds. One passenger was able to catch a flash of light as the object passed. The object seemed powered by rocket or jet motors shooting a trail of fire. The object had no wings or other protrusion, had 2 rows of lighted windows. So we've had reports of that sort of thing, even today. This is case 6, which is a more traditional UFO shape, which was an instrument technician was driving from a large city toward an Air Force base in 1952, saw an object from his car. He stopped his car to watch it. It suddenly moved up toward the zenith in spurts from right to left at an angle of about 45 degrees. It then moved off in level flight at a high rate of speed, during which maneuver it appeared white most of the time, but apparently rolled 3 times, showing a red side. About halfway through its roll, it showed no light at all. It finally assumed a position to the south of the planet Jupiter at a high altitude, at which position it darted back and forth, left and right alternately. Total time of observation was 15 minutes. Apparently the observer just stopped watching the object, which we've heard that before in the past as well. Sometimes UFOs are sitting there for so long The people get bored looking at them. So this is case 7. A flight sergeant saw an object over an Air Force base in Korea. In 1952, the object flew a series of spinning and tumbling actions. It was on an erratic course, first flying level, then stopping momentarily, shooting straight up, flying level, and again tumbling, then changing course and disappearing into the sun. It reappeared and was seen flying back and forth across the sun. At one time, an F-86 passed between the observer and the object. He pointed it out to another man who saw it as it maneuvered near the sun. Case 8, an electrician was standing by the bathroom window. In 1948, when he first sighted an object, he ran to his kitchen where he pointed out the object to his wife. Total time in sight was approximately 10 seconds, during which time the object flew on a straight and level course from horizon to horizon. Case 9, a farmer and his 2 sons were at a fishing camp in 1947. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He noticed an object some 300 feet away and 75 feet above the ground. He saw it against the background of the canyon wall, which was 400 feet high at this point. It was hedge hopping, following the contour of the ground, was sky blue, about 20 feet in diameter and 10 feet thick, and had pods on the side from which flames were shooting out. It made a swishing sound. The observer stated that the trees were highly agitated by the craft as it passed over. That's a very unusual object. So this is case 10. An employee at the supersonic laboratory of an aeronautical laboratory and some other employees of this lab were by a river when they saw an object. The time was about, I can't see that. Anyway, 1949. The object was reflecting sunlight when observed. However, he then looked at it with 8 power binoculars, at which time there was no glare. It was of metallic construction and was seen with good enough resolution to show that the skin was dirty. It moved off in a horizontal flight at a gradually increasing rate of speed until it seemed to approach the speed of a jet before it disappeared. No propulsion was apparent. Case 11, another object. In 1950, a reserve Air Force captain and an airlines captain were flying a commercial airlines flight. The airline captain directed the attention of the reserve Air Force captain to an object which apparently was flying at high speed, approaching the airliner from the south. The reserve Air Force captain focused his attention on the object. Both crew members watched it as it passed in front of them and went out of sight to the right. The observation, which lasted 25 to 35 seconds, occurred about 15 miles north of a medium-sized city. So you would expect that other people may have seen that object. Case 12, a musician from a radio station was driving to work in 1952 when he saw an object hovering 10 feet above a field. As he came abreast of the object, he stopped his car and got out to watch. Having an artificial leg, he could not leave the road since the surrounding terrain was rough. However, he was within 100 yards of it at the point where he was standing at the road. The object was not absolutely still, but seemed to rock slightly as it hovered. When he turned off the motor of his car, he could hear a deep throbbing sound coming from the object. As he got out of the car, the object began a vertical ascent with a sound similar to a large covey of quail starting to fly at one time. The object ascended vertically through broken clouds until out of sight, and the observer states that the vegetation was blown about by the object when it was near the ground. So that rocking from side to side is also reported now. And, you know, these are things that we thought were modern versions of the UFO, but it was not. I don't think, since it's been happening for like 70 years now. So the report goes on to say, having culled the cream of the crop, it's still impossible to develop a picture of what a flying saucer is. However, there's a low probability that any of the unknowns represent observations of a class of flying saucers. Like, what are they, drunk? It may be that some reports represent observations of not one, but several classes of objects that might have been flying saucers. So it's just going around and around in circles. They don't want to admit that there's flying saucers, but they're willing to say it might have been. Conclusions, it can never be absolutely proven that flying saucers do not exist. The conclusions go on to say that the data as a whole failed to reveal any marked patterns or trends. It's considered to be highly improbable that any of the reports of unidentified aerial objects examined in this study represent observations of technological developments outside the range of present-day scientific knowledge. So their conclusion is pretty clear. They don't think that flying saucers are real. And this is a very interesting segment of the conclusion. And if after reading a few reports, the reader is convinced that flying saucers are real and are some form of sinister contrivance, is very misleading. As more and more of the reports are read, the feeling that saucers are real fades and is replaced by a feeling of skepticism regarding their existence. The reader eventually reaches a point of saturation, after which the reports contain no new information at all and are no longer of any interest. This feeling of surfeit was universal among the personnel who worked on this project and continually necessitated a conscious effort on their part to remain objective. So in other words, when you study it for long enough, the mysterious is no longer mysterious, and the researchers finally lost interest in the topic of study, which I think happens today because there's no answer or solution to this problem, and people are sick of looking at it. So Blue Book's special report number 14 revealed nothing that nobody expected to hear. Blue Book was unable to obtain a consistent model of a flying saucer, and UFOs were now able to be explained away by swamp gas and ball lightning, and the entire phenomenon had become boring after a few years of punching IBM cards. But this is the Air Force. So what did the rest of the secret agencies in the USA think about the report? And what does this have to do with the impending NSA and CIA government mandated document release? Well, in 1952, while Blue Book Special Report number 14 was still in progress, a discussion paper titled Flying Saucers was lodged in the CIA's filing system. This is a copy of that. It's from the 14th of August, 1942. And it says, during the past weeks, with the phenomenal increase in the number of flying saucer reports, there has been a tremendous stimulation of both public and official interest in the subject. General Sanford held a press conference in which he stated that analysis showed no pattern of anything remotely consistent with any menace to the United States, and that recent Washington sightings were possibly due to temperature inversions, others to ionized clouds, ice formations, etc. It emphatically stated that the unexplained sightings could not have resulted from any experiments or tests conducted by the United States. This discussion paper provides another overview of the flying saucer problem, which would be for the benefit of those people in the CIA who hadn't been keeping up with the topic, I guess. And the overview included the most sensational official UFO encounters of the time. First one being the death of Captain Mantell, which you see down here. In January 1948, an interception was attempted at Godman Field, Kentucky, and the pilot, Captain Mantell, crashed and was killed. It also includes a dogfight over Fargo in 1948, a National Guard fighter pilot at Fargo, North Dakota, Lieutenant Gorman, coming in after dark, spotted a moving light below him, also seen from the field, and for 20 minutes put on a dogfight with it, finally being outdistanced at 17,000 feet. And the third incident they cited occurred in April 1949 at White Sands, when a Navy commander tracking a missile flight watched two discs maneuvering at high speed around the test rocket. 3 such sightings were made at White Sands within a month. So this is the CIA having its own little discussion about UFOs, which is quite separate to what the Blue Book was telling us. So those 3 events led to the original Project Saucer and also to the earliest attempts to befuddle the public. And this is made clear. The conclusion was that UFO sightings in general stem from 3 causes. Number 1, mass hysteria, totally at the top of the list. Number 2, hallucination and hoax. Number 3, misinterpretation of known objects. So that was the official stance, which satisfied much of the public, but not certain sensational writers, where they're probably talking about investigative journalists. So this is still the report from the CIA. The resulting highly speculative books and magazine articles, combined with continued reports of sightings, built up such a resurgence of public interest that the Air Force, early 1951, reopened its study, instituted a worldwide reporting system, and alerted its bases to intercept the unidentified objects. Planes had orders not to shoot. So previously, poor Mr. Mantell was told to shoot and he died doing so. Now the aircraft are told don't shoot. Grouped, this is still the CIA report, grouped broadly as visual radar and combined visual and radar, ATIC has two major visual classes. First, spherical or elliptical objects, usually of bright metallic luster, and some were small, 2 or 3 feet across, and we know that these things are still seen and have been seen very commonly. Most, the big ones though, are estimated 100 feet diameter and a few to 1,000 feet wide. There are variants in this group, such as torpedoes, triangulars, pencils, even mattress shapes, which would be the square shape, which the first time I ever heard of a square UFO was probably in the 1990s, and that kind of blew my mind. These are all daylight sightings. And even the nighttime UFOs are the same as what we see today. So the second visual group, all night reporting, consists of lights of various luminosities, such as green, flaming red, or blue-white fireballs, moving points of light, and luminous streamers. Both categories are reported as single objects in non-symmetrical groups and in formations of varying numbers. Honestly, it's just like they're talking about today, isn't it? But 70 years ago. Speed and maneuverability are also unchanged from present-day sightings. Reported characteristics include 3 general levels of speeds: hovering, moderate, and stupendous, up to 18,000 miles an hour in the White Sands incident. Violent manoeuvring was reported in somewhat less than 10% of sightings. Accelerations have been given as high as 20 Gs. With few exceptions, there has been a complete absence of sound or vapor trail. Evasion upon approach is common. So this report is quite different to the Blue Book report. It's talking about objects that have capabilities far beyond what they were capable of reproducing in the Air Force back in the 40s and 50s. And they're talking about these UFOs as if they are actually UFOs. Now, this is a report, as I said, and then right in the middle of this report is a discussion paper. And it's just bizarre. It's totally different font. It's on different paper. It's a strange little addition, but it's called the National Security Council Intelligence Directive, subject unidentified flying objects. And it goes on to authorize the CIA director to carry out a program of research. This is the CIA director, not the Air Force, nobody in the Air Force, the CIA, to carry out a program of research to solve the problem of instant positive identification of UFOs. They've not, well, they may have done that, we just don't know it, and we might find out in a few months. It authorizes the coordination of this directive with the Department of Defense and the Psychological Strategy Board, whatever that is. You can see here, the Department of Defense and the Psychological. What the hell? They're trying to mess with our minds? It also authorizes that the director of the CIA will bear the responsibility for the dissemination of information. What's that about? Has he got control over what we find out and what we don't find out? And then that document ends and we're back in this document. Outside knowledge of agency interest in flying saucers carries the risk of making the problem even more serious in the public mind than it already is, which we and the Air Force agree must be avoided. So this is the beginning, the embryonic beginning of the public disinformation process when it comes to UFOs. They've decided that we're making it a problem and that problem has got to be avoided. So this discussion document goes on to discuss 4 major theories to explain the flying saucer. First, that it's a US secret weapon development. This has been denied officially at the highest level of government, and to make doubly certain, we queried Dr. Whitman, chairman of the, on a top secret basis, he too denies it. So it's not US secret weapons. Is it Russian secret weapons? No. Though we know that the Russians have done work on elliptical and delta wing principles, we have absolutely no intelligence of such a technological advance as would be indicated here in either design or energy source. There seems to be no logical reason for the security risk which would be involved, and there has been no indication of a reconnaissance pattern. So they don't think it's the Russians. The third option was men from Mars, which they say here, the third theory, is the man from Mars spaceships or interplanetary travelers. Even though we might admit that intelligent life may exist elsewhere and that space travel is possible, there is no shred of evidence to support this theory at present. There's no slightest indication of the orbiting which were probably necessary and no tracking. However, it might be noted that Commander McLaughlin of the White Sands report and a number of General Hill's balloon people, whoever or whatever they are, and many others are reported to be convinced of this theory. So there's division in the ranks. McLaughlin and the balloon people believe that UFOs are men from Mars. And the fourth theory was natural phenomena. And no comment, like they're still vacillating around that one. And yes, a lot of them probably are, but not all of them. So just on this note, that the sightings, given adequate data, can be explained on the basis of misinterpretation of known objects or of as yet little understood natural phenomena. In December of last year, former CIA director stated that, very strangely, so he's a former director, so he would know, given that he had the power to decide what was known and what wasn't known. And he said, I think it's a bit presumptuous and arrogant for us to believe that there's no other form of life anywhere in the entire universe. What that might be is subject to a lot of different views. But I think some of the phenomena we're going to be seeing continues to be unexplained and might in fact be some type of phenomena that is the result of something that we don't yet understand. And that could involve some type of activity that some might say constitutes a different form of life. So is he giving us a hint? Did he mean a different form of life on Earth or from somewhere else? What was the meaning of that message? Are we going to find out in 6 months? I don't know. So this is where the flying saucer report ends. And then we move on to the CIA's analysis of the Air Force study, which was Project Blue Book. But before we get to that, there's another memo that was found in the CIA files that's dated to 1952, which is a year before Blue Book's completion. And this one's especially interesting because it outlines the CIA's attitude and response, and the CIA had plans of its own. So you'll see here, it's from the Director of Central Intelligence to the Deputy Director of Intelligence, and it's about flying saucers. So the flying saucer situation contains two elements of danger, which in a situation of international tension have national security implications. These are number one, again, psychological. With worldwide sightings reported, it was found that up to the time of the investigation, there had been in the Soviet press no report or comment on flying saucers. With a state-controlled press, this could result only from an official policy decision. The question, therefore, arises as to whether or not these sightings, 1, could be controlled, 2, could be predicted, and 3, could be used from a psychological warfare point of view, either offensively or defensively. So it's clear from the content of this memo that the CIA found UFOs threatening and were already trying to suppress information. It was also clear what the CIA thought of the common man, which is the public concern with the phenomenon, which is reflected both in the United States press and in the pressure of inquiry upon the Air Force, indicates that a fair proportion of our population is mentally conditioned to the acceptance of the incredible. In this fact lies the potential for the touching off of mass hysteria and panic. So I really don't like the tone of this, how they've set themselves quite apart from the rest of us. So from an operational point of view, 3 actions are required. Immediate steps should be taken to improve identification of both visual and electronic phantoms so that in the event of an attack, instant and positive identification of enemy planes or missiles can be made. B, a study should be instituted to determine what, if any, utilization could be made of these phenomena by the United States. Psychological warfare planners and what, if any, defenses should be planned in anticipation of Soviet attempts to utilize them. And C, in order to minimize risk of panic, a national policy should be established as to what should be told the public. So they're deciding what to tell us. We know. The idea that Soviets might have known more about UFOs than the Americans were also weighed heavily on their minds. So other intelligence problems which require determination are the present level of Soviet knowledge regarding these phenomena, possible Soviet intentions and capabilities to utilize these phenomena to the detriment of United States security interests, and C, the reasons for silence in the Soviet press regarding flying saucers. They also made clear that they didn't think that the Blue Book study would be adequate to resolve the situation. So the Air Technical Intelligence Centre, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, is the only group devoting appreciable effort and study to this subject. And this effort is not adequate to correlate, evaluate, and resolve the situation. So they believed, the CIA believed the Blue Book study wouldn't solve the UFO problem because the solution extended beyond the frontiers of our present knowledge. Okay, the study does not solve the more fundamental aspects of the problem, and the CIA consultants stated that these solutions would probably be found on the margins or just beyond the frontiers of our present knowledge in the fields of atmospheric, ionospheric, and extraterrestrial phenomenon, with the added possibility that the present dispersal of nuclear waste products might also be a factor. So they recommended a study group, so their own independent CIA-funded study group, be formed to perform 3 functions, which would be to analyse the factors which constitute the fundamental problem, that's more doublespeak, determine the fields of fundamental science which must be investigated, and make recommendations for the initiation of appropriate research. They also requested separately that the National Security Council start its own research into the problem. At the end, signed off with, I consider this problem to be of such importance that it should be brought to the attention of the National Security Council in order that a community-wide coordinated effort towards its solution may be initiated, signed by the Assistant Director of National Intelligence. And all of this was going on, all this panic and all this utmost urgency was because UFOs still kept being seen. So a year after the CIA flying saucer paper, and 2 years before Blue Book was published in 1953, the CIA documents, which probably are still found in the CIA reading room if you can find it, but it documented an advisory meeting to discuss the findings of the report. This was the Robertson panel. So this is the CIA report, which is the meeting of the OSI Advisory Group on UFOs, which was January 14th, 1953. Here's a list of the people present. You can see Robertson at the top. Hynek was there. The Robertson panel, which was assigned, this is Howard Percy Robertson right here. Doesn't he look well suited to discuss UFOs? So this was a scientific committee which first met in January 53 and was a direct product of the Intelligence Advisory Committee and the CIA review of the Air Force investigation into identified flying objects. So the members of the panel included Howard Percy Robertson, who is the chair, Luis Alvarez, physicist. There's just a list of who was there. There's a document titled Sanitized Minutes from this, clearly lists all members and associate members of the Robertson panel, along with their field of competencies. So here's the members, that's where they come from, and here's their specialties or competencies. Hynek was only an associate member, and associate members were not present for the whole duration of this conference. They were invited now and then to make a presentation. A document, Comments and Suggestions of the UFO panel, i.e. the Robertson panel, summarizes and discusses Blue Book's findings and provides a number of interesting suggestions for dealing with the problem. It was considered that normally it would be a great waste of effort to try and solve most of the sightings. The writings of Charles Fort were referenced to show that strange things in the sky had been recorded for hundreds of years. It appeared obvious that there was no single explanation for the majority of things seen. Foo Fighters were cited. These were unexplained phenomena cited by aircraft pilots during World War II. They were believed to be electrostatic, similar to St. Elmo's fire. It was the panel's opinion that some of the Air Force concern over UFOs was probably caused by public pressure. The result today is that the Air Force has instituted a fine channel for receiving reports of nearly anything anyone sees in the sky. This has been particularly encouraged in popular articles. The result is the mass receipt of low-grade reports which tend to overload channels of communication with material quite irrelevant to hostile objects that might someday appear. Okay, it was possibly dangerous in having a military service foster public concern in nocturnal meandering lights. It was interesting to note that none of the members of the panel were loath to accept that this Earth might be visited by extraterrestrial intelligence beings. You can see they've edited that here, of some sort someday. What they did not find was any evidence that related the objects cited to space travellers. One of the panel members in his presentation showed how he had eliminated each of the known and probable causes of sightings, leaving him extraterrestrial as the only one remaining in many cases. His background as an aeronautical engineer and technical intelligence officer could not be slighted. However, the panel could not accept any of the cases cited by him because they were raw, unevaluated reports, as in unevaluated by the panel of 4. This was an attitude in which another of the panel members did not concur, as he felt that such artifacts would be of immediate and great concern not only to the US, but to all countries. Nothing like a common threat to unite peoples. And that's, President Reagan repeated that many times, and he probably got it from reading this report. It was noted that present astronomical knowledge of the solar system makes the existence of intelligent beings, as we know the term, elsewhere than on Earth extremely unlikely, and the concentration of their attention by any controllable means confined to any one continent of the Earth quite preposterous. That's because they're assuming that UFOs were only seen in the United States. So they didn't think that there was any evidence of threat, and that the subjectivity of the public to mass hysteria was going to be a problem. So they decided on an educational program. The panel's concept of a broad educational program integrating efforts of all concerned agencies, so as in teaming all security agencies up, was that it should have 2 major aims, those being training and debunking. So they've decided at this lovely 4-day meeting to debunk the public. So training would result in proper identification of unusually illuminated objects, they hoped. Okay, the education could be accomplished by mass media such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles. Basis of such education would be actual case histories which had been puzzling at first but later explained. As in the case of conjuring tricks, there is much less stimulation of the secret if the secret is known. Such a program should tend to reduce the current gullibility of the public and consequently their susceptibility to clever hostile propaganda. Okay, psychologists familiar with psychology should advise on the nature and extent of the program. So they're getting psychologists in to try and manipulate the mass human psyche. This report even suggests avenues of doing that. The amateur astronomers in the US might be a potential source of enthusiastic talent to spread the gospel. That is true. Astronomers to this day are very invested in not seeing UFOs, or not believing in UFOs. The panel believed that the educational program of training and debunking might be required for a minimum of 1.5 to 2 years. At the end of this time, the dangers related to flying saucers should have been greatly reduced, if not eliminated. 1.5 to 2 years. How many years later is it? We're still the target of that debunking. The panel took cognizance of the existence of such groups as the civilian flying saucer investigators. It was believed that such organizations should be watched because of their potentially great influence on mass thinking. The apparent irresponsibility and the possible use of such groups for subversive purposes should be kept in mind. Very interesting. So a more detailed version of that, and it's very much more detailed because it goes into blow by blow of each day's proceedings. People's names are still redacted. It talks about how long they met for lunch, when they came back, and gives a bit more detail. And in this case, for example, the absence of any hardware resulting from unexplained UFO sightings lends a will-o'-the-wisp nature to the problem. But they are still pretty sure that there's no danger of hostile action from UFOs. Then they talk about artifacts of extraterrestrial origin, and it's pretty clear that they haven't thrown the extraterrestrial hypothesis off the table. They said it was interesting to note that none of the members of the panel were loath to accept that this Earth might be visited by extraterrestrial intelligent beings of some sort someday. What they did not find was any evidence to relate the object sighted to space travelers. Well, I think they did. It also outlined ways to keep the human herd happy until the educational program took effect. And it was recognised that such action would tend to allay public concern of the subject till an educational program had taken effect. I don't know how they were going to measure when this educational program had taken effect. Did you know also they were talking about how getting cooperation from military services, and in 1953 they made it a crime for military personnel to discuss classified UFO reports with unauthorised persons, and they could be imprisoned for up to 2 years or fined $10,000 for talking about UFOs. So this is the meeting where Captain Ruppelt advanced his plans for the continuation of Blue Book, and it was not met favourably. So the public face of Blue Book continued to be the official Air Force investigation of UFOs, but the reality was it had essentially been reduced to doing very little serious investigation. This is from Wikipedia, and had become almost solely a public relations outfit with a debunking mandate. So while the CIA and the National Security Council were in the background doing their own investigations, Blue Book was carrying on with this very strange debunking process. But the point being that as a result of these strange clandestine meetings in the 1950s, late 1940s and early 1950s, UFO research has been hampered by this 70 years of media-driven education, which you could class as operant conditioning, imposed upon the citizens of the English-speaking world, which is all of us. These measures were recommended and forced upon us by a group of selected individuals who were somehow able to marshal the forces of authority along with the unconscious forces of the human psyche as weapons of mass manipulation. So even the staff of Project Blue Book weren't immune. They became victims of their own hype, and the denigration of the UFO phenomenon within the armed forces, along with the official story that UFOs were not a threat and were not aliens because they were nothing more than reflections of ice crystals, appeared to have worked wonders. Blue Book continued for over another decade after this special report number 14, but its rotating roster of commanding officers showed every indication that they had succumbed to the CIA's education program, or worse, that they were continuing to enact the narrative laid down and debunking the UFO phenomenon whilst continuing to actively research it. So in 1954, Charles Hardin took over as the head. He apparently had little interest in UFOs and thought that anyone who showed a slight interest in UFOs was crazy. That's a picture of Hardin there. 2 years later, Captain George Gregory took the helm. He was anti-UFO, and under him, little or no investigation of UFO reports occurred. Gregory developed ways to classify UFOs such as they more or less disappeared. In 1958, Robert Friend took over. He tried to reverse the previous 2 years, but was hampered by lack of funding. And by 1963, Hector Quintanilla, which is him here, was in charge. Quintanilla continued the debunking efforts, and he was also said to be not competent from a scientific or investigative perspective. And looking at that picture of him there, he doesn't look very competent at all. And under his direction, Blue Book lost all credibility. So the education program had done its work. The populace became dismissive of flying saucers and little green men, and the disinterest of Blue Book's last few commanding officers had slammed the final nail into the coffin. So after 30 years of investigation and having no tangible output whatsoever, Blue Book ceased operations in during 1970. But while Blue Book was dead, somewhere over at the CIA, the dream lived on, which is what makes the government-mandated disclosure of all UFO information held by US intelligence agencies in the middle of the year so tantalizing, because by their own admission, they've been doing their own research for all this time. So will this information see the light of day in 2021? I don't know. I don't think so. Or are we going to see this sort of thing, which is pages exempted for legal reasons and names, places, and events redacted? And there we go. It's like a game of snakes and ladders, and we're still playing it. And that is the end of my presentation.